Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. They offer free checking with industry-leading mobile banking. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference. Visit firstbank.com to learn more. What's going on, Hokies fans? We're coming off the heels of a tremendous weekend for Virginia Tech Diamond Sports. Andy Bitter also had the opportunity to sit down and have a chat with Whit Babcock, Virginia Tech's athletic director. And of course, spring football is here. So why not have our football crew on set? We're ready to unpack all of it. It's episode 416 of the Tech Sideline podcast, and it starts right now. We're recording on a Monday, March 31st, 2025 from our high-tech studio right here at the Virginia Tech Corporate Research Center. Remember to like, subscribe, refer the show to a friend. And as always, I'm your host, Giovanni Heater. To my right, lead analyst and columnist, Chris Coleman. Across the way, the senior staff writer, Mr. Andy Bitter. And in our fourth chair, managing editor, David Cunningham. Producing the show behind the scenes, as always, the mustache man, Mr. Nick Brown. All right, guys, we have to start here by talking about this tremendous weekend that we had on campus and off campus for Diamond Sports and spring sports as a whole. So the baseball team, they go on the road, take care of business. They sweep number 16 Wake Forest. That's back-to-back ranked series wins for Virginia Tech baseball. And then the softball team, they had been red hot coming in, ranked 12th in the country, 16th ranked Stanford in town, first ever meeting. And in a series that was back and forth, come from behind in every single game, Virginia Tech beat Stanford by a run both Friday, Saturday, and then again on Sunday. So they complete the sweep. And here's an interesting nugget for you. It's the first time ever that baseball and softball both have a ranked series sweep in the same weekend. And it's the first time since 2022 that each of them have a ranked series win in the same weekend. And we all know what happened in 2022.
Yeah, exactly. The double sweep is rare to begin with, much less when you do it over a pair of ranked teams. This has not been the most fun of years for Virginia Tech fans in terms of athletics. So hopefully the spring sports can save face a little bit. And softball's been doing very well. Baseball got off to a little bit of a slow start in the ACC, but they've picked it up over the last couple of weeks. So hopefully that's a sign of better things to come for the rest of the spring.
Nice tease for later in the podcast where we talk about all the bad things in Virginia Tech athletics right now. I mean, not only was it like really nice wins, but like they were spectacular. Like they had a triple play where it was like a diving catch to the second base,
the number
to first
one
base.
play on Sports Center.
And then
First time it's ever happened
baseball
in program
team,
history.
a guy robbed a home run in right field. I think somebody else said that made Sports
Also
Center
top 10. They were both good.
Yeah.
On the same night.
Yep. So I mean,
Sam Tackett, who was on the podcast a few weeks ago.
So you have these plays, you have a walk-off homer on Sunday in the softball game to win it. I mean, it was exciting stuff. Not only just wins, but like thrilling wins on top of that.
I think the biggest thing was you're seeing good teams find different ways to how to win. Softball was out hit 27-17 this weekend and won all three games by one run each. And baseball issued 12 walks yesterday and still won. Like different teams find good teams find different ways to win. And I think especially we've known softball was going to be really good for a while, but you're starting to see baseball come around. Some really good pitching performances. The hitting has shown up in some big moments like it did yesterday late. And that was quite a crowd at Tech Softball Park this weekend.
Yeah, Saturday's crowd, outside of regionals and stuff, or when they have those extra bleachers, it was the most packed I've ever seen it. You couldn't get a seat. There was at least 100 to 200 people over the left field fence, all tailgates, whatnot going on. And then even further, there were people all over the concourse of the Beamer statue and standing on top of that platform to try and get a good view. So TSP was literally packed to the brim. It was alumni weekend, a sensational crowd. I don't know if I've ever heard a crowd roar for a diamond sport here quite like that triple play. Like it was unbelievable. So very, very cool. Very cool to be there to document the moments, no doubt. I did want to say, piggybacking off of this before we do get into our discussion here, it's setting up a very nice spring game weekend. So you'll have the spring game. Softball's going to host Notre Dame. Baseball's going to have a top 10 Florida State team in town. Lacrosse will have probably top 10 Syracuse team in town, and it's going to be the Remembrance Run. So this place should be packed, and if the weather's good, it might be a really great weekend.
Yeah, and goodness knows if they'll actually let you see anything in the spring game. whether they actually have an actual game. So you might want to get a little more entertainment by going to one of those other events. Not to say that you shouldn't go to the spring.
Do you think
game.
when you buy a spring game ticket, they'll make you sign an NDA once you go in? So you can't disclose anything that happens in that stadium.
I've been to I went to a comedy show, John Mulaney, and they take your phone. You have to put it in like a pouch.
I went to one of those in Vegas.
What if they do that at a spring game nowadays? It'd be crazy. I could see that happening in the future.
Something tells me they're not going to be able to pull that off.
True. Fair enough. All right, let's get into our discussion a little bit here. Andy, you had the opportunity, you and a couple other journalists as well, to sit down with Whit Babcock for about 50 minutes. What can you tell us about that surface level before we get into the meat and potatoes?
Yeah, a couple things come out of it. He sort of went over some of the money situation, with this house settlement coming up and how they're going to break down this. And it's going to be $20.5 million in revenue sharing that schools are going to be able to pay out to the players. He said that Virginia Tech's payroll will probably be sort of in line with what the back damages percentages have been. 75% for football, 15% for men's basketball, 5% for women's basketball, 5% for Olympic sports. Now, that's just revenue sharing. There's still NIL on top of that. And I think sometimes people kind of confuse the two things when they're talking about, NIL money that they're getting. So there's going to be revenue sharing. Then you can have sort of what they intended NIL to be, before it went into effect, where essentially it's become pay for play right now. They're going to try to get back to name, image, and likeness where it has to pass a clearinghouse. We'll see how that works. I'm not confident that their little clearinghouse thing is going to be all too effective in that. And I think teams will find ways to sidestep that whole thing. But that's the intent, at least. Generally, this is what I took away from this, is that he can't win. Babcock can't win right now. Whatever he says, this fan base is going to lose its mind over it. And I think Brent Pry is in the same situation right now. Whenever I quote something from Brent Pry in a press conference, it's just a feeding frenzy on Twitter. I mean, people are just negative and, oh my gosh, try winning some games for once. Like, every single comment is the same way. And I think everything I put out there from Whit Babcock was exactly the same way. And I think we're at a point in this athletic department, in this, the major sports in this thing, where the talk is over. They have to start producing at this point. And that's true of football. That's true of men's basketball right now. I think women's basketball is still, it's a transition period from the previous coach. I don't think people were pleased with how the season went, but I don't think anybody's holding Megan Duffy to account too much for that. But, I think Brent Pry has been a lot of talk so far, has not really had the results on the field. Mike Young, there's been talk every year about increasing NIL and things like that, and they have been, a bottom half of the ACC type team the last couple of years. And Whit Babcock's been here for 12 years now, or he's in his 12th year, and is overseeing these programs, and they're struggling right now. When that's the case, people are going to be very upset about stuff. So it's something I've noticed, especially this year, that anything I put out there and anything that gets up on the message boards, it is extremely negative, the reaction to it. I think talk is cheap at this point. Need to see results.
It's been trending that way for Whit ever since the press conference in December of 2020 when he dehumanized Brad Cornelson.
Yeah, that wasn't a great moment.
That's when it really started.
Speaking.
Yeah, it was not a great day for him, and so people have been all over him.
For those that maybe weren't there, including myself, could you explain that a little bit?
Well, that was the one where everybody expected that he might fire Justin Fuente.
He held a press conference to talk about why he was retaining Fuente.
On the day his buyout dropped.
Right, on the day his buyout dropped.
Which turned out to be a coincidence.
Right.
It's you guys should think about that before you do.
He went on this meandering series of statements and things like that where he talked about dehumanizing Brad Cornelson when he meant humanizing. He talked about calling up other coaches to ask him if Virginia Tech's offense was difficult to prepare for, and the other coaches were, oh yeah, it's really hard to prepare for, right?
It didn't go over well.
It didn't go over well with the fan base. And so it's been like that ever since, and now it's even worse. After a bad football season and a bad basketball season, things have kind of reached that point where, let's face it, we're a lot closer to the end of the Whit Babcock era than we are to the beginning. It's just a matter of when now. When is it going to happen? What's the trigger? I know there are more eyes on him now, and that includes from Tim Sands. Tim Sands, I've heard, has gotten onto that athletics committee as the chair, and it's opened his eyes to a lot of things in terms of athletics, particularly fundraising, and he's starting to ask more questions. of the athletic department. So I think Whit's under a lot of scrutiny from a lot of different people, not just the fans, is what I understand. He also changed some comments since December, which was his last public statements. In December, he said, as far as the revenue sharing went, he talked about how they were going to break it down for past athletes. And it was the percentages you threw out there a few minutes ago, Andy. At that time, he said the current athletes, they were only going to play football, men's basketball, and women's basketball players. And for Olympic sports, they were just going to make up for it with more scholarships rather than actually giving them revenue share. So if he's saying now that they're going to give the Olympic sport athletes revenue share, that means they're taking that away from
No, I think it's the same percentage.
I think within this, some of the 5% for Olympic sports could be a new opportunities and scholarships.
Okay, so that's included in the
just to be clear about that.
I think a lot of the 5% for Olympic sports, some of it's going to go to scholarship.
And again, this is sort of ballpark. He didn't say this is exactly what they're doing. He said it's going to look similar to that breakdown. So in terms of new opportunities with new scholarships, because larger rosters and guaranteed roster spots, I think that might be where you see that 5% for Olympic sports. Okay. Obviously, for football and basketball stuff, it's going to be just straight money for previous scholarship athletes.
Yeah, I think Virginia Tech, now this is asking the athletic department to communicate, which, as we've talked about plenty of times, they're not particularly good at. But going into the summer, when the fiscal year flips, I mean, there needs to be a written page out there saying, here's how we're handling revenue share. And, you don't need to say, and I'm sure you can't say legally what this player is getting and that player is getting, but it needs to be broken down clearly on a page where the fan base can go to and say, this is how Virginia Tech's athletic department is breaking things down from a rev share standpoint. But again, this athletic department would not teach a class in how to communicate with the fan base, so we'll see.
Well, I'll be curious what becomes public record once that gets out there. I mean, certainly the amount that they're spending, where they're spending that revenue sharing in terms of sport. Is this any different than a contract for a coach? I mean, could you find out how much a player is being paid?
I don't think you can because he's not an employee. I think you can probably find out how they're spreading it around in terms of what program.
Well,
but I don't know. There's only one way to find out.
We'll see. We'll test find the limits of the FOIA process once this goes into effect July 1 here. But, a lot of the conversation with Babcock was about money and about the status of the main primary coaches in the high rev sports here. Brent Pry says he wants to see noticeable improvement from that on that side. I said, what's noticeable improvement? He's like, I think you'll know it when you see it.
Well, he said he's not going to name a win total because he doesn't believe in that.
It was a smart idea.
Right.
Because if you name a win total, I mean, it was like when Iowa is like, we need to score 25 points a game in the season for Brian Ferentz to stick around. And everybody's like, well, we're going to calculate it every single week. And as soon as he had like one or two shutouts on there, it's like, he's done. It's over. You can't get there.
You'd have to,
at this point. You're going to have to put up like 70 on a couple of different teams. So it's a bad idea to put a numeric figure on there because, all records are not the same. Like you could go 8-4 and not beat anybody of note. You could go 6-6 and win a couple thrilling games, and they might sort of be the same type of season. But wants to see noticeable improvement in football, and then a lot of talk about basketball and NIL allocation. And he was saying that they underestimated the market this year in terms of NIL, and he said they were roughly in the ballpark with schools like UVA, NC State. He said LSU. Later, should be noted, all those teams stunk this year.
Below 500.
Did not do well in terms of it. So they clearly underestimated the market and said they were about 70%, or Clemson spent 70% more on NIL. They came to find out later on, and you look at how Clemson did in the season. Second place ACC finish, 5 seed in the tournament. Money talks in that situation. So I think he took a lot of heat for that on Twitter and the message boards from what I saw. I think it's maybe not quite as simple as people think, that this is still a fairly new thing, this NIL, and judging how much you're going to have and what the market's going to be like this, especially with, supposedly the end of this, sort of gold rush in NIL coming with the new clearinghouse that's coming up. A lot of these deals are going to be backloaded, and a lot of schools dumping money for lack of a better term on some of these players this year. So I think this will still be a pretty pricey market coming up this year, and got to do better on finding what the market is and paying the players correctly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard some stuff about NC State and their NIL. They had the NIL money to spend, but they wanted to fire their coach. So the donors held back their NIL money strategically because they thought they were going to have to be paying a buyout this year, which they did, right? So that was strategic on their part. Now their new coach is going to have more,
and they got a
NIL
good coach
money.
too.
Exactly, and he's going to have
They're
the money
going to win
to
a lot
spend.
of games.
What a fool's gold Final Four that was. We got to keep Kevin Keats for another year now because it's like, my goodness.
Kevin Keats made a lot of money on
I've
that.
never seen such an obvious situation where they wanted to get rid of the coach, and then he played his way to another year, and they're like, all right.
Oh my God, we won the ACC.
Kudos
Do
to
we celebrate?
Kudos to NC State for not being blinded by the fact that they just got hot.
Exactly.
1 year. They got hot. They went on a streak. They, some bracket luck there and got through the whole thing to the Final Four. And then they're like, no, this is not the future here. And I do think they have a much better coach here going forward.
Yep, no doubt.
Yeah, it's crazy. How about the fact that, and I think we knew to an extent that this was the case, but the other thing that seemed to stir everybody up, besides the 70% for Clemson thing, was the fact that he said, listen, we weren't taking basketball funds and giving it to football, and that's why basketball stunk, for lack of a better term.
Well, the reason people suspected that is partially my fault, but I never accused them of that, per se. I just went over situations last spring that I know a couple of Virginia Tech players went out there and were telling people that they did not get the money that they were promised. And that kind of coincided with a bunch of new football signings and things like that. And I didn't accuse anybody of anything, but I did note that what happened at Florida State, where it pretty clearly happened because their basketball players went on strike. I said, what happened at Florida State, it's not immune to happening at other schools too. And honestly, at this point, I'm not. I mean, seriously, think about it. Like that press conference we talked about earlier when he talked about, well, I called up a bunch of other coaches and asked them what they thought of Brad Cornelson, and they all said, oh, he's great. Do we actually think he did that? But,
Maybe.
and even if he did, what would you think a bunch of other ACC coaches to say, right? So I just don't put a lot of stock in what he says, and I'm not saying he's lying or anything because I don't know. The fact of the matter is Virginia Tech screwed it up, and I heard. I was hearing last spring that Mike Young was complaining about NIL funding. I was hearing it this time last year that he was really complaining. And I heard there were heated, raised voice conversations in the athletic department about men's basketball NIL a year ago. So the fact that I was hearing that then does make it a little bit hard for me to believe that Whit, when Whit says, well, I was given an amount by Mike Young and I met that amount. When I have been told by multiple people this time last year that Young was not happy about the funding. So again, I don't know anything for a fact. Nobody knows anything for a fact about NIL. We don't know how much this guy's making, that guy's making. We don't know what the overall amount is. And that's what's so frustrating to people. And not only that is it changes on a year-to-year basis. You get one big donation in 1 year, and then if that donation goes away, then your numbers back is a lower amount the next year. Or it could be vice versa. There's no consistency to it. But what's clear is that somebody or somebodies at Virginia Tech screwed up, and hopefully they've learned from their mistake, and they've got it going in the right direction from here on out.
Yeah, it's tough to get a handle on figures. And even, Whit said, in his conversations trying to find out sort of what other schools had spent on this, he admitted, it's a bit of liar's poker. Like, do you trust these people to tell you that they're telling the right thing? The bottom line is it needs to be more. And this is the reality. Like, people can sit there and complain and moan about, college athletics and the road is going on. This is the way it is. All right. This is the way it's going to be. And I guarantee you right now, the 4 teams that are in the Final Four are well funded on the NIL front. They did not cheap out in that case. So I'm not saying you have to match that to be in there, but you have to be competitive to put together a competitive roster. That's just the way it is now. You have to meet payroll. That's what it is. They're not going to call them employees, but let's be honest, they're employees. And I think the NCAA would be in a lot better place if they would just admit that and move to contracts and get the stability that they want in this whole thing. But, whatever they've been doing the last couple of years, they have not been up to snuff in terms of, roster construction. And I think a lot of that stems from how much they're paying the players. So you got to pay a little bit more and figure out a way to do it. And I know people are going to complain about that, but that's the way the sport is right now. And got to do it.
David, let's get you roped in over here.
Chris, you mentioned that it changes on a year-to-year basis. I would actually say it changes sometimes more on potentially a day-to-day basis
And semester to semester.
in the offseason. Yeah, I mean, there are times where if there are two players that are, as good, and one of them gets a pay bump essentially somewhere else, right? That shifts the market. Every little thing shifts the market. And I look at the overall situation, Whit's comments and whatnot. It doesn't really matter, I guess, who was in the wrong and how Tech got to this point. I think the overall thing is it shows that Virginia Tech was reactive instead of proactive. Like, it was a lot of, hey, this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to hope this works. And I thought what Tech did with football, as far as funding the football program, Tech was very proactive in that. Hey, here, whatever you need, you'll have it, right? But here's a bunch of money to start. I think with basketball, a little bit more, hey, I mean, if Mike's, if Whit's saying Mike asked for a certain amount, well, that stuff's changing all the time. And I think it's important that, Chris, as you've talked about before, that Mike Young has somebody on his staff that understands the market and understands market value. You have to have somebody that can tell this is what this player's worth, because you can't trust the players.
Right.
Like Jim Larinaga said that in his
We're their
retirement.
agents.
Yes, but in his retirement press conference, he's like, there were guys that told me this is what they were getting offered from other schools, and it was like double what they were actually getting offered. So it takes a lot of Virginia Tech being proactive to succeed in this era. You can't just sit back and wait and hope. And I'm very interested to see, I mean, obviously we're in the offseason right now for men's basketball. Very interested to see what this looks like.
I think a key thing to say on this is not easy.
No.
Like, trying to find this money and allocate the money correctly, it's not an easy task. And it's not like this is a money bag school here. And we're talking about, I'm looking at the USA Today revenue database. Virginia Tech, 38th among public schools that responded. So when you talking about Power 65 teams, or Power, I guess, is 68 now, the bottom third, once you add the private schools in there, that, Miami's and Notre Dame's and schools like that are going to be very high on that list. So you're talking about being in the bottom third revenue wise. And, among that, it's not just media deals that puts them in the bottom third. It's also donations. That's always been a challenge here, is to get the donations up. So this is a challenge for anybody that would be in charge of this athletic department, is trying to raise those funds, trying to allocate those funds correctly, and do it to be competitive enough and sort of punch above your weight class in this whole thing. And I think people need to remember that when they're doing that. This is, they say, Moneyball, that was brought up in the December thing that Whit Babcock did with Bill Roth. It's not quite the Oakland A's here, where you're completely stripping everything down and trying to come up with the stats that
We'll find it in the aggregate.
We can move to Las Vegas.
Yeah, it's not the pie. It's the worst team, then a pile of this, and then you're underneath that. It's not that situation, but it is a challenge. And for schools that are not as deep pocketed as others in this NIL era, it's not only trying to find money, get it to the right people, find undervalued players and undervalued traits and stuff that might not be as expensive in other spots, but people don't want to hear that, because that's an excuse for why things aren't going great. You have to do better with the hat. And, that's not to say all sports are like that. Football was pretty well funded. I think Whit said top third of the ACC in that sense. And from that regard, that was a very disappointing season that they had. But I do think you need to remember that there is a money component to this that is very challenging that even the best ADs out there, I think, would struggle with.
Yeah, and I want to talk 4 staffing positions. Whit can help himself out by hiring a Hokie Club head with actual experience in fundraising at major schools, and he refuses to do that, and I don't know why. And I can't believe at this point that nobody's forced him to do it, because they should. And I can't hold my tongue on that any longer. I can't believe that we don't have a fundraiser, an experienced fundraiser, as head of the fundraising arm. It just doesn't make any sense. Like, if you were building that program from scratch, is that how you would build it? No. It's absolutely ridiculous. Second thing is within Triumph. I think when Triumph swallowed up Commonwealth NIL, Commonwealth NIL was focused on basketball at Virginia Tech. Nick Rush ran it. He did a good job. I went to a Commonwealth event one time, and I'll put it this way: there was someone who has architecture named after him at Virginia Tech, sitting at a table with. Who was there? Sean Padula, Rodney Rice, Hunter Couture, or not Rodney Rice, Darius Maddox. The athletic department threw its weight behind Triumph. Triumph swallowed up Commonwealth. Now there's no individual fundraiser for men's basketball NIL, and there's no advocate for men's basketball, no verbal advocate in any conversations that gets had or anything like that. So I think Triumph needs to hire a basketball-specific NIL fundraiser. And I think that could help that situation out a lot. Agree with you 100% about having a staff member on the basketball team that understands market value. And then there's an assistant coach position open, and I'll go ahead and throw it out there. We hear there's a strong chance that former Virginia Tech assistant coach Chester Frazier will return to Blacksburg and be the Hokies' top assistant. He's a guy who's been at Illinois. He was most recently at West Virginia. Has a reputation as an outstanding defensive coach. Was not the defensive coordinator here before, unlike some people think, but I do think he provides valuable feedback and instruction on that into the court. Mike Young tried to bring him back 2 years ago, but it didn't work out. But it looks like he's coming back now. And I hope I'm not jumping the gun there, but we've heard that from multiple sources at this point, that it's sounding more and more like it's going to be Chester Frazier.
It's so interesting how you have 2 programs with polar opposite issues. With football, you had 6 guys go to the NFL Combine. The money was there. You had a great roster on paper. And for whatever reason, the coaching, whatever you want to say it is, job doesn't get done. Basketball, you have what at least the fan base, and I think even coaches across the league would argue is a good head coach with a great basketball mind, and can connect with his players. Yet you don't have the players to get it done. So it's interesting how the issues are different. Wanted to ask David a basketball question here. You have leagues like the Big East, the A10, where they're not going to have to, when it comes to rev sharing, deal with most of that money's going to football. How is this going to impact basketball when places like VCU and the list can go on and on? Villanova, well, they play FCS football, poor example. Marquette, for instance, whatever it is. Xavier, they can pour all of their funds into their basketball programs. How does that impact the ACC?
I tell you, the SEC and the Big Ten are not going to like it. I mean, and the bottom line is that the price keeps going up. Like the money's going to increase every year. Like if it was $5 million to have a Final Four team this year, might be $10 million to have a Final Four team this upcoming year, right? And you already know who that all falls back on. It's going to be really interesting how a team like a Villanova or a Georgetown or a Providence or, again, those Big East A10 schools that don't get a Gonzaga, right? Like teams that can go all in on basketball because they don't have a football program. They put the SEC and Big Ten at a disadvantage, which is why it's going to be super interesting to see if the House settlement passes and when the clearinghouse goes into effect, what that does. Because NIL will, in theory, be capped. Like, there's, it's all fair market, in air quotes, I say.
Right. Up to anything over $600 has to be reported.
I think there might be a good chance you end up seeing big schools go back to having bagmen, like just giving guys money under the table, right, to make up for it. Because obviously there's revenue sharing, and you can make up for a lot of it there. But if, say, Xavier is funding the $20.5 million and is giving 85% of it to men's basketball, okay, well, Arkansas is funding $20.5 million and giving giving a good chunk of it to football, right? You got to make up that gap somewhere if you want to be competitive. I think it'll end up evening itself out, but it's going to be very interesting for a while. And I think coaches recognize that, like, the Big East, for example, is, I don't want to say untapped, but it has potential a little bit, at least until the whole thing kind of evens out, that the Big East has some maybe potential momentum that nobody else could have.
Yeah, that's why I don't think this clearinghouse thing is going to work.
Yeah.
Because water always finds its level, right? Like, the money will find a way to get to these players, and the Big Ten and the SEC are not going to sit there and allow this to happen. They control everything in the NCAA as it is. You think they would just sit back and be like, well, we'll be at a disadvantage in basketball on this side? No, they're either going to try to change the rules or going to circumvent the rules. And like David said, they have methods of doing that. I'm not saying ACC schools are not like this either. Like, all these schools have done it before. They can do it again. And if it has to be under the table, I think they'll do it that way. And it feels like they're trying to, like, cap the value of these players. It's like, well, that's not market value if he's getting, over $600 to do this, autograph signing thing. It's like, what do you mean? That's what the market says he's able to get paid from this thing. I mean, he's worth that. These people are willing to pay that much for him to do that. So that is his market value. So I don't know exactly how they're going to address that and say that, no, this is the limit that you can have. This is fair on this thing. It's like, well, somebody's offering me that money. That's the market value. If somebody's offering the money, I found it. It's out there. Yeah. So this is why, again, I just feel like you have to get to some point of stability with this whole thing. And you need to have contracts with this stuff, but you can't really have contracts unless you admit these people are employees of your team. I don't feel bad for the schools and the coaches at all when they sit there and complain. It's like, oh my gosh, you got to re-recruit your roster all the time. It's like, well, admit they're employees then and sign them to contracts. And then if they try to break the contract, then I'd be like, yeah, well, you got a contract. But until that point, quit complaining about it and just, deal with the system that you've set up over your, incompetence and indifference over the last 25 plus years.
I think the coaches would be good with that at this point. I think it's the university sides that are holding that up, like the school presidents who are the NCAA, basically.
Well, and I think
they want to sit there and complain that, tampering and people are poaching our rosters. Like, what? There were like 4 or 5 coaches in the NCAA tournament that were prepared to leave for another school. Like, Kevin Willard did not want to go to the Sweet 16. Right. Like, can I just go to Villanova already? This is ridiculous. So he has to go through this week-long charade where he's calling out his athletic director who left, and people are like, I haven't even talked to Villanova. Talked to my agent about this. Like, dude, you've already moved in there basically at this point. So,
and it happened, by the way.
Like, what's tampering at this point? Like, these schools have basically hired these coaches away. So if it's fine for coaches, then what's the problem with players if they're doing this too?
Right. And a part of that too is like, they've always said, well, you can't scrutinize the players. They're just kids, right? Well, the days, and I'm not saying being a student athlete isn't a mental toll, but the days of them being kids is gone. The second you're making money, you're essentially a professional athlete. And, there's baggage that comes with that.
Well, if I was footing the bill for that, if I was a donor, and I'm not, my sports writer salary is not going to support that whole thing, nor would I do it. But if I was footing the bill for some of these guys where I'm paying $1 million for a player or something like that, they don't perform or they're, screwing around off the field and stuff like that. Yeah, I'd be pretty upset in the return on my investment there.
Yeah.
No doubt. The only thing I can predict is there's going to be more lawsuits. Like, this is just another fork in the road that's going to, I don't know where we're going. I don't know where it's going to end up, but this is just going to, another one of those forks on the way to wherever
the first clearinghouse thing that gets rejected, that'll be a lawsuit.
No doubt.
And I feel like they'll fold because they always fold because they have no legal backing for all of this stuff. So Fun times.
Yeah.
Wild West.
It's just tough because it gets so out of hand. Something else I realized the other day is that there are still kids in college where the COVID waiver still applies. So it's like, and meanwhile, the NCAA, those kids have taken medical red shirts. That's the only reason why. But the NCAA's out here talking about potentially going to 5 years of eligibility, and it's just like.
I saw that.
It just continues to spiral out of hand from both the money, the eligibility perspective, the no contracts where anybody can basically leave anytime they want. Like not too long ago, you had to sit out a year when you transferred. And now it's like there were a couple different kids that played for Virginia Tech this year that were at a school, came in, played for Virginia Tech for a year, left, and will be at a new school, 3 schools in 3 years. And it's just, that's the way it is.
But I'd like to reiterate, that's the school's fault.
Yeah.
Right? Because they've insisted this entire time, these are student athletes. These are not employees. They're student athletes. They're just like any other student. And any other student can up and leave for another college whenever they want. They like, if I'm an art major, I don't have to sit out a year if I transfer to Michigan. You know? Like, if your credits transfer, you can go as well. You don't have to sit out before you can start drawing art once you go to that school. So you can't sit here and say, oh, we're going to restrict you from going somewhere else. It's like, well, that sounds like a non-compete. This sounds like a lot of employee contract talk here. So I think people always are like, oh, these spoiled athletes and they're getting all this money and stuff like this. It's like, this is the result of what, all the schools and the NCAA, which is comprised of the schools, it's just doing the schools' bidding at this point. They have dragged their feet on this thing for how long? Well, coaches got rich. Athletic directors got rich. Administrators got rich. Everybody, the players were getting rich in this whole thing.
You're building waterfalls.
And now once the players are getting some money, now it's out of control. Now it's the Wild West. It's like, well, you created this situation. And then they're sitting here looking to Congress, like, help us, Congress. Like, you talk about a pipe dream, like a fantasy. Figure this out yourselves. Have somebody in charge and actually give some concessions if you want to get something back.
The one thing that'll never change is the millions of people that are going to sit on the couch with a beer and watch the game, no matter what. No matter how we get there, when the ball's tipped off.
I don't know. People are like, I'm out on college athletics. I haven't watched. And then they end up tweeting more at me when they're watching the games. Like, well, I don't necessarily know that you're out.
People the reason it's this way is because we watch, right?
Right.
So, like, if you're complaining about how it's gone, well, you're one of the reasons it's there because you watch so much.
TV contracts aren't going down.
Right. They're certainly not going down. Now, to my credit, I haven't watched a single NCAA tournament game.
That is why you're punishing yourself, Chris.
Oh no, it's been great and everything like that, and I'm in favor of players being compensated. I don't like. Turning on the TV and I'm like, who's that, right? Because guys play 4 years and for 3 different teams, right? And I can't keep track of it.
It's not even that to me though. It's the logos, it's the music, it's the CBS. There's a nostalgia to it. I'll watch the NCAA tournament no matter who's playing in it. That's the draw.
Yeah,
that's the draw. Not that Rodney Rice is playing for Maryland. Grab 5 though.
I mean, is it the brands? So if it's about the brand for you, then why are the players getting paid?
Oh,
right,
dude, it's the Wild West. I don't know. What do you want me to say? But I guess my point is it's people aren't stopping watching. Ratings are higher than they've ever been.
Right.
And across the board, football, basketball.
Well, and one of the interesting things, I think Whit talked about this with Andy and some of the other guys. The ACC. Like, schools are now going to get paid for viewership with the Florida State Clemson stuff, right? You talk about viewership, like Virginia Tech playing on Friday nights. That's something that Whit mentioned. So, like, eyeballs matter.
Yeah.
Chris Coleman turning on his TV matters.
Enter Sandman is going to help Virginia Tech because they like to throw it on a primetime ACC network game, and though the ACC network doesn't push the needle, like, that helps. People like to watch Virginia Tech on TV.
Yeah, I mean, Virginia Tech's going to be one of the schools that benefits from that. Not quite as much as Florida State.
Not initially, because there's already 4 years that are baked into the numbers.
Right.
And they have been great lately. They have been a very viewed team. But, this year they have the South Carolina opener. Mm-hmm. That's on a Sunday. It's probably going to be around 4 or 5 o'clock, something like that. So I think Miami, Notre Dame.
That sounds right.
That's the night game. I believe those are the teams playing.
Yes.
They play Florida State this year. They play Miami this year. They got Cal on a Friday night.
They got Louisville this year, right?
I can't
Pull
remember.
up the future schedule.
But Whit was talking about Friday nights, like that's sort of the new Thursday nights because you're not competing with Friday night or with the NFL in that sense. I don't know if I completely agree. He pointed out how successful Dion was on Friday nights last year in Colorado and the ratings. I'm like, well, was that Friday night or was that the Dion effect that everybo's tuning in to watch?
Probably
Colorado?
hope that it was the standalone game, but, but it's definitely the
there's
Dion
no
effect.
NFL that night. That's
Sure.
the big thing. The NFL is this Goliath that is just, if you go up against it, you're going to lose in that sense. So the Fridays, I guess, are better. So I think this year could get some better viewership numbers, and certainly some success would help if they got better on the field.
Yeah, it would be nice.
Tech's going to play Louisville and Blacksburg at Florida State. They'll play Miami. For what it's worth, they'll also play at NC State.
So yeah, so you're talking about Tech is playing a lot of teams this year that are top half ACC brands. Or top third ACC brands.
The following
Plus
year,
South Carolina.
They got
And Vanderbilt, I'm sure, will be on one of the ESPNs, right?
I mean, last 4 games they got Louisville, Florida State, Miami, and Virginia, and that comes after Cal on a Friday night, right? So there are opportunities.
And everybody wants to see ODU.
oh, that's right.
in Wofford.
The following year, they'll play at Clemson, at Miami, and they will play NC State. Not as heavy in 2026.
So I think Whit himself says they expect a little step back initially in terms of those viewership numbers, but this year should help tremendously on that front.
All right. Let's ask one last question about this, and then we're going to get into spring football. I promise. Overarching between Andy's sit down, everybody's personal opinions, and everything everybody's gathered in this football and basketball. If you had to tier separately football and basketball, like where does Virginia Tech fit into the chaos of this, both in the ACC and nationally? Is it like complete middle of the pack? Is it worse? Is it better? Where are we at? How do we feel?
I think they're in the boat that a lot of schools are. And if you're not at the top, I don't want to say if you ain't first, you're last, Ricky Bobby style here, but I think a lot of people look at it like that. Right? If you're not, top of the heap in terms of NIL and stuff, like, what are you doing even participating in this whole thing? And I think there are a lot of schools in that same boat that kind of have to figure out how do you compete in this new era. And some are doing it. I mean, listen, Duke doesn't have a better funded football program than Virginia Tech does, and they've been more successful in the field over the last 5 years. So, what are they doing that Virginia Tech is not? Is that funds allocation? Are they getting it to the right people? Are they just, misevaluating? Is this not the coaching staff to get the job done here? I mean, these are questions you have to answer. So, all of this is adding to the fact that this is such a critical year for Brent Pry coming up in the fall, because you have to start showing, like I said at the beginning, you have to start showing some progress on the field. And for both men's basketball and football, I think they're sort of in this, uneven spot where it's like, how do you compete in this era? They got to figure out a way to do it.
Yeah, Virginia Tech certainly is an Ohio State, but they're certainly not like what is Rutgers going to do? Rutgers already loses $20 or $30 million a year that their university has to compensate their athletic department, right? So they're already 20 or 30 million in the red every year. Now you add 20.5 million on top of that. Like Rutgers is, even though they're in the Big Ten, they're not one of those schools that's going to be able to sustain the spending and all like 100% revenue share every year. Like I don't see how Rutgers stays at the top level of athletics every year. Virginia Tech is certainly not Rutgers either, right? Which makes it all the more sad that Rutgers just beat Virginia Tech twice in a row.
Well, they had that one play last year,
right?
So.
Right, yeah. Yep. So
this is why I think eventually you get to this fracturing of the power schools, and then not in, people think it's going to be between the Power 5 schools or Power 4 schools now, I guess, and the Group of 5 schools. There's only 5 still. There's now 6, whatever it is. That division, I think there'll be even a further fracturing of it, where there's going to be the schools that can pay this and then some, the 20.5 easy and then some, and then there's others that are like, I don't know how we're going to get to 20.5 every year.
So basically, all right, so there are about the same number of Major League Baseball teams, NFL teams, hockey teams, and NBA teams. It was about 30 for all those sports. As high as what, 32?
32
NFL, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So that's high-level professional sports can support about 30 to 32 teams. I've got a feeling that eventually that's about the number of college football teams at the highest level is going to be able to support.
I mean, you would know this better than I, but that's, it's Premier League, right?
Yeah,
Premier League's how the whole
20.
thing was formed.
Right, exactly.
Basically, is the high performing, high brand places are like, why are we sharing this money with all these other schools? I think this will come into clear focus here, where this 20.5, and it's going to go up every year. I mean, there's escalators in that whole thing, is going to be a strain on these athletic departments. And I think it was was it St. Francis?
Yeah,
They're D3.
They dropped the D3. There's like, we're done with this.
And they just played in the tournament.
Yeah, we're done with this. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of these Power 5 schools or Power 4 schools, I keep saying Power 5, drop down to D3, but they're probably going to decide, hey, it's maybe not worth it to be all in on this revenue sharing every single year if it's going to put us in the red here.
Well, and I think the tough part that maybe people don't necessarily grasp about this is the 20.5 million. It's not that it's raising the ceiling, it's raising the floor. Like, everybody's starting at that now, or at least all the big brands are. Like, you've got, if you really want to be competitive, you've got to throw in NIL on top of that. It's all about the money now. Gio, you asked where Virginia Tech stands. I think, like, the football program, I think, is pretty well funded. You got to, win games. Like, not to you can't really sugarcoat it. Like, they've got to go out and win games, but they've got the resources to succeed. And I thought the most eye-opening thing was at Pro Day the other day, there were a lot of talented guys on this team this year, and Virginia Tech only won 6 games. Like, Tech has to start winning on the football field. Basketball, it's a little bit different. Sounds like Mike Young has more backing this year. We'll see what, if Chester Frazier is the assistant coach, that's a terrific hire. And we'll see how Mike Young does in the portal. But he won, he's finished middle of the pack this year with maybe the second worst roster in the league. He can coach. If he can get talent in there, I think Tech will be okay. Whether it's an NCAA tournament team, we'll see. But I think I'm very interested to see, like, this is a crucial year overall for Virginia Tech, football and men's basketball especially, in so many different ways. You got to win. And for the head coach's jobs, but also for the athletic director's job.
Yeah, you're right. And we talk about Tech being bottom third of revenue. Well, for me, like, if you fired Brent Pry and Mike Young right now, that doesn't change the fact that Tech is bottom third in revenue. So the long-term story is going to be the same unless you find ways to improve that revenue. So I go back to what I talked about earlier. We need a Hokie club head who's an experienced veteran fundraiser at big schools. And I think men's basketball needs their own specialized NIL advocate and fundraiser. And because I don't think, when you're in Virginia Tech's position, you can't just assume, the money's going to be there. I mean, there's still more money to be had if you make the right decisions at the athletic department level. I don't think, yes, everybody could use more money. Football could have actually done more with less money last year. That doesn't mean you still shouldn't try to raise more and give them more, right? But I just think Virginia Tech can do a much, much better job when it comes to fundraising. And they can't help what TV contract they have, but they can help what decisions they make as an organization, as an institution, to help them with their fundraising.
Well, as always, Tech Sideline is presented by First Bank and Trust Company. Today's TSL podcast is also sponsored by the Hokie Way. The Hokie Way's 2025 auction starts on Tuesday, April 1st, so be sure to check it out and bid on over 100 items and experiences. The proceeds benefit Hokie's NIL, which is obviously what we're talking about, so visit thehokieway.org to learn more, register, and bid. We'll drop the link in the YouTube description down below. All right, let's talk some spring football here, guys.
Is that going on right now? Spring football?
Yeah, right? Amidst all of this. Let's talk a little bit of spring football. You've now been to 2 practices at this point. Of course, you've said that you don't see much, but what can you tell us?
We're not going to see an 11-on-11 snap until the spring game. And who knows then?
Who knows?
Maybe they'll just pair off into groups and just do drills or something like that. It's tough. It's tough to like take too much out of it. I mean, the other day, sort of the big picture story was that Pry, he highlighted the running backs, thought they made some plays. The guys battling some injuries. The first time Marcellus Hawkins was out there, Coney's been dealing with something, and they all made some plays in that spring practice, which is the way they talked about the running backs before the spring. You didn't even know if they were going to have enough for a spring game. So the fact that they were out there and making plays, I think, is good. I'm not going to say all of a sudden they've, replaced Bashaw Tootin in the production that he had last year, but maybe more encouraging to hear that early in the spring practice. The other part of it was that, Price had sort of an up and down workout. And that's, there are a lot of guys making mistakes on basic stuff, and they're still sort of in the 100 level, teaching of spring here, where they got to try to get the basics down. So I think people hear that and they go, he's in year 5 or year 4 now, and they're still doing 100 level stuff. It's like, that's what spring ball is you start with the basics, especially when you're installing new schemes offensively and defensively. You have to get that stuff down before you can get more advanced. And even if this was a veteran team, they'd be doing 100 level stuff right now just to get that baseline of understanding for everything that they do. So, it's a process. And again, we haven't seen a whole lot. So we'll see at the spring game sort of what this product looks like. It's tough to even piece together what their defense will look like schematically. I would imagine you're probably going to see some more outside linebacker, edge rusher types in those roles. I would imagine you're probably going to see some more 3-down lineman formations, but I don't know what the base defense is going to look like. It's going to be versatile and multiple, and they're going to have a lot of different things out there. Probably some 3 safety looks, because that's what Seifkes has done at his previous stop at Arizona. But in terms of telling you what a starting 11 would look like, I think I would struggle to come up with the correct players in the correct positions right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do know now for a fact that the spring game is not going to be televised.
Not going to be televised.
It has a time slot. And they're going to show some highlights and do some interviews.
To be clear, that is not a Brent Pry thing.
Right.
I don't think he minds it. But sure. the ACC as a whole was like sort of condensing the spring game products into an hour-long window, not just strictly showing the broadcast, because that can frankly be kind of boring.
Yeah, I think so. I think people are going to enjoy it.
So
more.
it means when they rerun the spring games over and over and over and over and over, that they'll have like better products to show.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a way, I could see it. It's all right for people that just want to see the team and how they're playing on the field. I think some people just want to watch some football in the spring, and not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily have to be great football, but they just want football. They just want to see their team on the field, snapping the ball and running on the field, and not another interview with Brent Pry or an interview with. Who would be the senior guy they talk to right now?
Right. There's so many ones.
Yeah, I guess Kyron Drones. But I just, you only get so much of that. Sometimes you just want to see them snap the ball and run down the field, do some actual football stuff.
Yeah, the only thing I can tell you, and I can't get into any detail on this, but the offensive line is really struggling right now with injuries. They have a number of key players out, starters and backups, to the point where they're having to play guys in positions where they don't want to play them. So the offensive line is not making any progress right now, and it's probably even taken a step back. I know that's not what anybody wants to hear, but that's what my understanding is. Everybody's impressed with Matt Moore. He's doing a good job, but he doesn't have much of a deck to work with right now in the spring. So hopefully that group can get healthy pretty quickly. And but that's not something we can tell from the 15 minutes a week we get in there or whatever. But again, that's going to impact the spring game. Like, there's never any good depth on offensive lines to begin with, and now you throw in the fact that some guys are injured and they're splitting into 2 different teams.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a deal where they don't even go into teams, just go offense versus defense. And again, that would be entertaining. That'd be fun to watch.
Honestly, it'd be better.
The competition between the white team and the maroon team, and then some convoluted scoring system. Right. I don't know. I don't need to see like a winner in the spring game. No, he's like, oh man, 5-game winning streak for the maroon team, really knocking it down. It's like, that means nothing to me. How'd they even split these teams up as it is? So
I can't. I honestly can't stand spring games. Like, there's just nothing. You're playing yourself. I don't know. They're just not enjoyable.
It's there for the weather, and for a good turnout to come out.
And that's the difference. Like, I never grew up with the spring game being a spectacle. In fact, the best part was the dome being packed for the lacrosse game after, right? So what I'm stoked for is
That's
everyone's
such a Syracuse thing to
I know,
say.
I
Oh
know,
my
I know.
gosh.
First time we
Hold on.
made an hour without talking about
No,
that.
no. He mentioned Syracuse earlier. Wait, so they did the spring game, and then they had a lacrosse game like directly after that.
correct, but like there's a little bit of a buffer in between. But if you went to the spring game, you could stay for the lacrosse game, and it was always against a top 10 team. I mean, Syracuse's schedule in lacrosse is always loaded anyway because the ACC is so good, but it was always like a big game, and it was like a day of it, which is why I can't wait for the softball and baseball games that weekend because they should be packed. Number 10, top 10 Florida State in town is going to be awesome.
Sure. I remember back in the day, before we had a press pass, all of Tech's scrimmages were open. Like, you just walked into Lane Stadium and watched the scrimmage. Like, there would be like 3,000 fans out there watching the scrimmage. You could tell a lot more from those scrimmages than you could the spring game. Like,
And
I
it
would
clearly hampered the program for the
we
the
never
Bull
won 10
Street.
games or anything like that. I agree with you, Joe. The spring game itself, as far as the actual football game, is pretty worthless.
The only moment in my 4 years of a spring game at Tech I remember, besides Sandman, and I do love like having the Hokies in town, and it is it's a great day, especially when the weather's good. The only thing I remember from a spring game is seeing Pop Watson throw that like 40-yard touchdown. That's it. That's the only, like, I can't remember. You never remember what happens in the spring game.
You remember vaguely sometimes. Some players have stood out in spring games where I'm like, when I covered UVA, Chris Long had like 3 sacks, quote unquote sacks in the spring game. You're like, okay, he's coming at this point.
Who was the defensive end that had 3 sacks for Tech?
Jeremy Haynes.
Jeremy Haynes. Spring game warrior.
Caleb Farley, the first time he was out there in the spring game, they had him play offense for part of it, and he was turning Brandon Faison around throughout that whole game, and Faison was good. And you're like, okay, this is going to be a guy. And like, bummer that never got to see Caleb Farley play offense here as well. I think he could have been one of those two-way players if they gave him the opportunity. Hendon Hooker's first time out there, I think he was like 10 for 10 or something like that in the spring game. Like, he looked very good. Josh Jackson first time out there. Yeah. Sometimes you can see, the next wave of these guys, if they let them do enough to go out there and show it. It's so few and far in between that happens. There's the perfect marriage of the right situation. They give them the right opportunity, and they actually go out and make plays.
And maybe the difference has been in our 4 years, you got teams that have never won more than 6 regular season games, and on top of it, they hide a lot in the spring game. Like, we weren't seeing APR rush the passer in the spring game.
Well, believe me, now you're not going to see anybody do anything in the spring game if they have their choice with it.
How are we doing on the injury front? And David, I know you had something that's coming to you in just a second. How are we doing on the injury front outside of the offensive line? I know we're looking at that with the receiver room, the running backs.
Yeah, I think Tucker Holloway was still in blue. Like I said, some of the running backs are back out there. PJ Prelo's still in blue, but the fact that he's in blue right now, I think is
impressive.
More progress than I thought he would be making based on kind of how severe we heard that injury was last year. Defensively, there are some guys there too as well. Jordan Bass. He's been in blue so far. Trying to remember any others, but I think it's not any more significant than what it was to start the spring. Now, who knows? We're going to be out there tomorrow. Maybe we'll see some more.
Yeah, I think for the most part, except for what's going on with the offensive line, they appear to be a pretty healthy team right now, which is all you can ask. But again, offensive line's pretty important.
Yeah, I was going to mention, he mentioned PJ Prelo. He's a guy who shined in the spring game last year, right? You think you get, even in some of those moments, you get a sense of some of the third, fourth guys down the depth chart, just a sense of what they can do. And to be fair, I mean, was it the Miami game that Prelo had that long run that was called back from that phantom Caden Moore holding call?
He was about to have a bigger role in this offense right when he got hurt the next week at Stanford.
So you can get a sense of some guys. It's not everybody, and there's sometimes where you have to take a little bit with a grain of salt. But and also in the spring game, we were just talking about all that. We spent a bunch of time on this podcast talking about money. That's why Virginia Tech's charging for the spring game. And that's why Virginia Tech's charging for parking, because Tech needs money.
Parking, big time. There's going to be a lot of people that just go to park, and they know it. They know that people go to park, tailgate, and don't even go inside for the game. So I wonder how that's going to all work out if you were trying to park for baseball or softball.
The cage is free.
The cage is still going to be free?
Yeah, there are going to be other free lots, but it's just going to be the lots, I think, around Lane.
Castle and South and...
Probably. I mean, don't quote me on
Interesting.
it.
Sure.
But,
Chicken Hill.
yeah.
Interesting. All right. Last one on spring football here. Coach has talked about these adaptable practice schedules. What's the breakdown here, and what are the thoughts on it now a couple of weeks in?
Just in terms of what they're going to do, I think Pry is very much like, he's not like, oh, it's Friday of the second week, we have to do what we scheduled ahead of time. He's going to see where the team is at that point before they progress to the next stuff. And I think a lot of that ties in with that 100 level stuff. And he said it the other day, it's like, we're not going to do 300 and 400 level until 100 and 200 are achieved, because that's benefiting nobody if you fast forward that process. So it'll be interesting to see what they're doing out there this week, if they advanced a little bit, or if they're out there kind of doing the same thing they were the first week.
Anything from Pro Day that you could take away from? I know obviously Tootin and Strong didn't do a ton because they were so heavily involved at the Combine. So maybe you can intertwine the Combine into Pro Day, but what was that like?
Very different from last year. There were actually some guys there that people were looking at, quite a few of them, to the point where, David handled the story because I was doing the Whit thing that day. It was almost too many to talk to.
Yeah.
And when you think of the 6 guys at the Combine, and then
They had 17 guys work out.
on top of that, it's Stephen Gosnell, it's Ollie Jennings, Keontae Jenkins. There's a lot of guys on this team that could latch on with the team. And on top of that, it was kind of cool. Daryl Tapp was back there. He was there representing the Commanders, obviously, but he ran the D line through their drills when they did position drills. And I think it was kind of a cool thing for some of the former players like Josh Fuga, Cole Nelson, who were coached by him in the past.
Yeah, that is pretty cool.
Did you see the numbers Colin Schlee put up?
Yeah.
God, that guy's an athlete.
Schlee's, his numbers are ridiculous. APR had, I believe, a 40-inch vertical leap. Some of these guys, Aeneas Peebles, APR, Bashal Tootin, some of these guys, Jalen Lane, you look at their numbers, they're like top 3 or first in like what they did between guys at the stack up against guys at the Combine in certain stuff. Like, there are a lot of dudes that worked out the other day, and first time in a while that Virginia Tech has pretty good chance to have a handful of guys drafted come late April, which is pretty exciting.
It's exciting, but then you look at the record last year and you're like, what could have been?
Yeah.
Right?
With Schlee, I was actually talking with Brent Davis just about how things are going with the tight ends, how he likes that new role. And he's like, I went up to Schlee and I'm like, you should pack on like 20, 25 pounds and try it as a tight end.
He ran a 4.51.
You look at the athleticism he has. He jumped out of the building.
39 and a half inch.
Yeah, broad jump was ridiculous. His vertical was ridiculous. He's pretty fast. And we saw it last year as an athletic quarterback. And you've seen quarterbacks in the past make that transition. They were a little bit bigger than he was. Somebody like Logan Thomas, who was already 240, 250 to begin with. He was a tight end, many people would say, even from his time at Virginia Tech. But with what they do with these nutritionists and these weight rooms, I think you probably could tack on 20, 25 pounds fairly easily.
Quickly,
I don't know how well he holds weight like that, but if it's a shot to make an NFL roster, he's probably not going to make it as a quarterback. Let's be honest. If he wasn't starting last year or playing last year all that much, if it's an opportunity to try to make it as a tight end, it might be worth a shot.
He's got to hit the Chris Coleman program.
Well, his issue is always healthy. Like, he gets a concussion every other hit he takes, basically.
Well, he's running as a quarterback.
Right.
I think it might be different if you're you don't have the ball in your hands the whole time.
Yeah.
You catch it, and there are ways to protect yourself, I think, when you're doing that. So I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting insight from a guy who's now coaching tight ends that has, been around the game quite a bit and seen quite a few players.
All right, what's coming up on TechSideline.com editorial content before we let everyone go?
I talked to Ben Bell last week. Ben, did I say that right? Ben, yeah, Ben Bell.
Ben Bell. So many new players.
I said his name and I'm like, that sounds so weird. Is that wrong? I talked to him last week, and I can already tell you it's going to be a fantastic story because he's a fantastic storyteller. And I'm not going to spoil it because we got to get him on this set, by the way, for something, because just him telling this story, I was riveted for like 5 straight minutes with him telling me the story. So I'm not going to spoil it or anything.
It's hard to wow you, Andy. That's impressive.
It was really well done. It finished, and I turned to Travis Wells. I'm like, he was awesome, like incredible storyteller. So it's in fact it's such a good like way of telling the story. They got to figure out how I'm going to tell the story and like improve on it somehow. But a pretty interesting guy. That guy. And I think Virginia Tech fans, as they get to know him a little bit more, will like him. He's going to be one that I think at press conferences we're going to request frequently because he has that kind of energy to it.
Basketball. We've got baseball, softball, of course, and everything going on there. But the portal's open for basketball. Women's basketball team had a couple official visitors over the weekend. Both teams have been pretty active in terms of reaching out, contacting official visits, whatnot. Should be a men's basketball assistant coach coming soon. So, yeah, lot going on the basketball front. It is the off season, but the portal is ever turning.
Hey, David, is Clara Silva coming back to Virginia Tech?
I don't believe so.
Thank you for clarifying, just so everyone can chill.
It would make sense.
What you got, Chris?
I have no idea what I'm going to do this week.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, what I want to talk about is stuff I don't know anything about, like defensive scheme and things like that. But I can't write another article just saying I don't know, right?
Sure.
I've had to do that so many times this offseason. Can't do it anymore. So I don't know. We'll see what the week brings.
Nick, how about on the video front? I know we got a lot of good stuff. We might have some Diamond Sports content loading up the week.
That is correct, and I want to go back to last Friday. We have a video with D1 softball Justin McLeod, and the fact that he was in Blacksburg for this weekend is like having College Game Day in for your softball series. Big deal. Big deal. And he was great. We didn't really even talk about Virginia Tech softball team, but more about the landscape of NIL and how the Virginia Tech is fitting. And by the way, very, very well. Virginia Tech will remain good at softball, and it seems to be like Olympic sports. We asked him a lot of great questions about the country and how he's gauging the NIL space in Olympic sports, and Virginia Tech fits very well. So very interesting video that I'll have right here. Yeah, so click that right there.
The crazy thing is they have to share with all the Olympic sports that 5% we talked about throughout the majority of our podcast today. Just crazy how it all breaks down. All right, with that, I think that wraps up episode 416 of the TSL podcast. So for Nick behind the scenes, for David, for Andy, for Chris, I'm Giovanni. We'll see you next time.